Hello again, friends. I mentioned before that if Barkal was unbanned, it would create a fourth S-tier deck. The S-tier decks include Majesty Lord Blaster, Dragonic Overlord the End, Tsukuyomi, and Barkal Soulsaver. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to state this. I don't think that there's some super hidden secret mix deck or rush deck that's tier SS++ that wasn't really played at the time, predominantly due to just how nutty the big four decks were at this time. While decks like Kage Royals and Hellfire Ritual were able to beat bad players who guarded improperly, a big four deck guarding when a single card could reasonably stop a damage would beat those decks. While decks like Manguard and the $10 Hyper Budget Rush deck were incredibly effective at rushing down enemies and could absolutely steal games from the big four, the big four, other than Barkal Soulsaver, all have mechanisms to deal extra damage with their Vanguard at a higher consistency than other decks, and rush decks have no mechanism to prevent their Vanguard from taking that extra damage. All of this is to say that there simply does not exist a deck that competes with the big four in this format. But which of the big four would be the strongest in Vintage? I think this is an interesting question given that Barkal was banned prior to Set 5's release, so we don't have any format in which Barkal Soulsaver had regular matchups against MLB and DOtE. We know that Barkal Soulsaver edged out over Tsukuyomi during Set 3, which is why Barkal was banned after Set 3, but Tsukuyomi wasn't touched until after Set 9. Tsukuyomi had many tops, but MLB and DOtE had more tops. While the power gap between the decks isn't substantive in my opinion, I do think it's fair to state that Tsukuyomi was harder to pilot and had less representation at the top tables because of this. It's debatable if Tsukuyomi being weaker to Barkal Soulsaver Dragon would make it the weakest deck of the four in this format due to its lack of topping representation. I'd argue that it's roughly as strong and wouldn't personally dock points for it having that particularly bad matchup. The next deck to consider would be Dragonic Overlord the End. The deck has access to 12k beaters, fishable null guards or boosters, or targeted retirement, and most importantly, a cheap advantage generating, restanding 13k Vanguard. I would state that I believe firmly that Dragonic Overlord the End was stronger than both Majesty Lord Blaster and Tsukuyomi when played optimally. It was also an easy enough deck that playing suboptimally hardly punished you. It was able to wall with a 13k defense against most other decks who were unable to field units that could hit for 13k unboosted, while being entirely unable to boost from having their back row consistently sniped, and from having a limited amount of boosters from having to ride a grade 1, and having 4 null guards in your deck eating up 5 of your boost slots, so you are very limited in how many total boosters you had. But just because I would rate Dragonic Overlord the End as the strongest deck in the physical card game, does that still hold true in Vintage? Well, not quite. The third deck we'll look at is Barkal Soulsaver. This deck has a favorable matchup to Tsukuyomi, but it has unfavorable matchups against Majesty Lord Blaster and Dragonic Overlord the End. While all three decks can make magic rows against one another, Majesty Lord Blaster and DOtE simply need to call a vanilla behind a 12k to do so. Barkal Soulsaver needs to either have rearguards on the board ready to buff with Soulsaver or Lohengrin, or they need to use main phase Soul Charging. Generally, Dragonic Overlord the End is sniping their Young Pegasus Knights, so this is an uphill battle. Now, it should be noted, with Baron, Young Pegasus Knight, and a Margal, that's all you need to make a single 23k row. And that's pretty strong, but that's also a unit that's being targeted by their retirement, and a -1 from hand to do so. The deck could run Palamedes as a 2-of to try and handle the defense of Dragonic Overlord the End and Majesty Lord Blaster, and even gets an advantage of hitting 22k with Young Pegasus Knight, who can't be targeted by the MLB player, with a Lohengrin, Soul Charge, and a single Palamedes in the front row. But I think the Dragonic Overlord the End matchup is so detrimental that even if you could argue it's comparable with MLB, which I kind of doubt, it's still absolutely falling behind in the rankings due to its very poor matchup to Dragonic Overlord the End. I'd say of all of the decks, the absolute worst matchup out of any of these decks playing each other would be Barkal Soulsaver fighting Dragonic Overlord the End. Does that make it second place? Third? We'll see. The final deck, the one with no pronounced specific advantage over any of the other three decks other than maybe Barkal Soulsaver Dragon, is Majesty Lord Blaster. It is also the, spoiler alert, strongest deck in this format by my current estimation, assuming all other things are equal, other than the singular confirmed rule change. A rule change which disproportionately favors this specific deck. You might be thinking, Tim, which ruling change are you talking about? Well, we've been confirmed to be keeping the G-Assist mechanic for Vintage. This means that at the cost of 2 cards in hand, you can select a grade 3 from the top 5 cards of your deck and add it to your hand. You might be thinking, okay, how does this specifically and uniquely benefit MLB in a way that it doesn't benefit the other decks? Well, let's take a trip back through memory lane to 2012 and 2013. Here are a few deck lists topping from Japan. You can see for this first deck list, we have 4 MLBs. For the second list, we have 4 MLBs and 1 Alfred. Going into 2013, 1 MLB, 3 Soulsaver Dragons, 1 MLB, 3 Soulsaver Dragons. I know that these are the same deck lists, but they're different tops. And then 1 MLB, 1 Exculpate, 2 Soulsaver Dragons. Tell me if you're seeing a pattern here. Now, that's not to say that it was normative to run only a single copy of MLB or 4 or fewer grade 3s. It was actually uncommon, yet due to a particular card, Wingull Brave, and due to the unwillingness of the Vanguard community to guard anything before grade 3, in the years of our Lord 2012 and 2013, you end up seeing pretty stark patterns of only a couple of MLBs with potentially backup SSD rides due to them being fishable with Pongal. What was this supplemented with? Beating the ever-loving crap out of your opponent early. MLB is a deck that's in a unique position, given that it has direct access to 10k and 12k beaters that are live on turn 2. A starter that only needs to have the blaster at boost hit to guarantee your grade 3 ride, and if you already have it, it guarantees your setup. This allows MLB to open very aggressively without failing to ride up if the opponent doesn't guard Wingull Brave. By now, with the addition of the G-Assist mechanic, assuming you're running 4 copies of MLB in your deck, even if they stop Wingull Brave and then snipe it with Gatling Claw Dragon, you can still ride up nearly all of the time while still having perfectly skewed rushing ratios. And that's not even to say that you couldn't run Pongal and a single copy of SSD as a backup anyway. And as time passed, the tops with MLB were progressively running fewer and fewer grade 3s in the deck list. This eventually culminated in a deck I saw top, although I couldn't find it on the website. It was a deck list for MLB that ran only 2 grade 3s, both MLBs. And under the current vintage system with G-Assist, assuming they do block your Wingull Brave and then snipe it, your odds of hitting a 2-of on G-Assist with 40 cards left in deck is nearly 25%. The odds of having already seen the MLB by this point would be even higher, especially with selective mulliganing. And again, that assumes that they had the cards necessary to block your Wingull Brave in the first place. All of this is to say that of the decks which would benefit from G-Assist, which would be minorly for Barkal Soulsaver and Dragonic Overlord the End, absolutely negligible for Tsukuyomi because you do not want to shuffle that deck, MLB comes out wildly on top for this rule change if you're running skewed ratios, and skewed ratios seem to be what MLB was looking for towards the twilight years of the deck before it got banned, because people were still playing it and winning with it after a full season of the anime had passed after it was released. Consequently, Dragonic Overlord the End, which I say edged out MLB slightly prior to this, may very well get steamrolled before it can get set up now, and may be slightly unfavored in the matchup given that MLB can run skewed aggressive ratios with impunity and beat the crap out of Dragonic Overlord the End before it has that 13k setup, so then it has to guard everything after that point. Thus, if I were to make my own little tier list for which decks I think are the strongest in vintage format specifically, I would go SSS++, Majesty Lord Blaster, Dragonic Overlord the End, SS++, Tsukuyomi, Barkal Soulsaver. MLB gets to benefit the most from the rule changes of the format, and was barely behind Dragonic Overlord the End before, if we're being completely honest, so I am bumping it up one. DOtE gets little benefit, but at least still some benefit from G-Assist, and was already the strongest prior to this. It also has very favorable matchups to Barkal Soulsaver Dragon, the new Tier S deck. Tsukuyomi gets no advantages from G-Assist whatsoever, but its solid overall matchups put it in third. Finally, my prediction is that Barkal Soulsaver Dragon, while it can still blow a hole through conventional wall decks, will get smoked by MLB's aggression and can't poke hard enough to get through DOtE's wall, while still getting smacked down by bar burning Hornrows. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one.